Hi guys, welcome back to the pit. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built the school terrain piece for my Normandy bolt action table. In a video I released earlier this year, I detailed my plans to build a massive Normandy table based on Bougie, a real town that saw action in both the First and Second Battles of the Odon in World War II. In that video, I built the table's base, which included the town's roads and topography. The school section I build in this video occupies the area of land between Rue de la Vallee and Rue de Ary, which is depicted on my table base here. It was only after doing a bit of research that I discovered that this building on Rue de la Vallee was actually a school in the recent past, but is now the town hall. Unable to find more info online, I actually contacted Bougie Town Hall to try and get some more information or historic photos, but they quickly stopped answering me.
Kevin Creed must be no.
However, I decided to go ahead and build the school just based on Google Maps Street View and some educated guesses as to what it might have actually looked like during the war. First step in the process is to create the building's interior. I start off with the small MDF terrace house built by Sarissa Precision. To improve realism, I replaced the original windows with HO scale windows from Tichy Train Group. I carefully removed the MDF window grills and slightly enlarged the opening to fit the new frames. Once the basic structure was prepped, I gave the entire interior a white undercoat. For the floors, I used wood planking plastic sheets by JTT. I cut them to size for both levels, painted them light brown, and applied a soft tone wash. After drying, I dry brushed the boards with a mix of light brown and white. I also highlighted the edges and shaded random floorboards to add depth. Once finished, I glued the floors down using liquid nails. To bring the interior to life, I printed out dollhouse wallpaper patterns.
Yumma, 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 yumma. Break a leg.
I'm gonna get changed. Come down for a few beers if you want, but don't hang around for this shit.
I trimmed the wallpaper to fit, including around the windows and doors, and glued them onto all four walls on both floors. Next, I made side skirting using thin strips of scale lumber. I also repurposed the MDF kit's card, window and door frames for the interior. I painted and lightly weathered all the trim and frames before gluing them in place. Once the detailing was done, I glued the two floors of the building together. With the interior finished, I moved on to the stone exterior. I used 3mm thick cork sheet to create the stone surface. I cut 4 panels to fill in the recesses at the front and back walls of the building, ensuring that the window slots matched the new window frames. Once everything fit snugly, I glued the cork sheet in place. Next, I cut out 1cm squares to create the building's cornerstones, as well as 1cm by 50mm rectangles. I glued these along all corners of the building. I also built stone frames around each window opening, using the actual window frames as placement guides so everything would slot in neatly later. To simulate rough cut stone blocks, I began by scraping the surface of the cork sheet with a saw blade, giving it texture. I then cut the sheet into strips of various widths, and then cutting those into irregular block lengths. I then glued these down onto the building using PVA, creating an irregular, rough pattern like on the real structure. Before gluing each block down, I used a file to round the edges, giving them a natural shape. For the pitch sections of the wall, I let the blocks overhang the roofline slightly and trimmed them flush with a hobby knife once the glue had dried. To fill the gaps between the stones, I used gap filler as mortar. I applied it generously, then used water to clean the filler off the block faces, leaving it only in the crevices. Once the gap filler had dried, I gave the exterior a white undercoat. After masking off the windows and roof, I airbrushed a layer of Vallejo buff as the base stone colour. Using reference photos of the real building, I hand-painted individual blocks in various earth tones, light browns, greys, and other muted shades. I then applied a light tone wash across the entire surface. To bring it all together, I mixed a mortar wash using grey and white pigments with water and PVA glue. I brushed this over the stonework, letting it settle into the crevices. Once dry, I selectively added a dark tone wash. Next, I dry brushed the surface, using a mixture of white and buff, and selectively shaded and highlighted individual stones. With the stonework done, I moved on to the exterior details. I started out by building the gutters. To do this, I used a styrene angle strip to form the front face of the gutter. I cut 2 lengths of the angle strip the same width as the roof. I then cut out 2 flat styrene strips to act as the connector between the angle strips and the building. I then glued the angle strips on the flat strips and capped the ends with more flat styrene to enclose the gutters. For the gutter brackets, I used very thin, half-round styrene strips. I cut small segments out and glued them evenly along the gutter front, and then gently bent each one back underneath to form realistic brackets. To make downpipes, I cut 2 narrow styrene tubes to match the building's height. I added thin styrene strips around them to represent mounting brackets, spacing them evenly along the length. For the roof, I used JTT plastic roof shingle sheets. I cut 2 pieces to size, and then joined them underneath using a sturdy styrene angle strip. I then added another strip on top for the ridge tiles. Using thin styrene strips and more half-round styrene strips, I built a decorative gable along the roof's edge. I then used small segments of half-round strip to replicate individual ridge tiles, gluing and bending each one over the ridge, just like I did with the gutter brackets. Next up were the doors. I modelled these doors after the actual building's doors, cutting window openings and gluing down styrene strips to create panels and rails. For the rear door, I used Tichy Train Group HO scale windows to mimic the half-glass French doors seen on the real structure. To recreate the building's distinctive French shutters, I used styrene card with fine panelled detail. Each shutter was the height of its matching window and half its width. For the open shutters, I added 2 horizontal support beams and a diagonal brace. On the closed shutters, I glued on 2 cross beams, then created hinges using tiny square styrene strips and thin pipe segments. From the Rubicon utility and light pole set, I took 2 wall-mounted lamps and assembled them, setting them aside for painting and final installation. Next, I gave all of these components an undercoat of paint that would later be revealed via chipping in the final coat of paint, and then applied a matte varnish, followed by a layer of hairspray to prep them for chipping. The final paint colours were white for the doors, windows and shutters, and light grey for the gutters and downpipes. Once the top coat dried, I used a rough, wet brush to chip the surface, exposing the timber colour underneath the shutters and doors, and a rust colour on the gutters and downpipes. I added highlights and subtle weathering with dry brushing and pigments. For the roof tiles, I painted them dark grey, applied a dark wash, and then a dry brush. I also painted a few tiles in slightly darker or lighter shades for variation. With that all done, I glued all components to the building using superglue. With the building complete, I moved on to creating the schoolyard. In current photos, the yard is covered in bitumen or asphalt for the American viewers. I want to assume that it would have been paved back in World War II, but maybe with just an older material. So I opted for a cobblestone pattern plasticard to create that. The real yard sits recessed, bordered by a raised curb and garden beds. To replicate this, I cut the plasticard into the general shape of the schoolyard, leaving space on each side for the gardens and curb. The current layout includes a tear-shaped garden island near the entrance, so I recreated that using styrene strips. I cut 2 lengths for the island's straight sides. Then using a compass, I drew the curved ends of the garden island, then cut out multiple small angled styrene pieces to match those curves, forming a complete teardrop shape. I rounded off the corners of the schoolyard, and then began gluing 1 centimeter long curb strips around its edge. Then I added curb strips along the road surrounding the entire yard, leaving a gap for vehicle access, just like what is seen in World War II era aerial photographs. Once all curb elements were in place, I masked off the area and sprayed the curbs with a primer, followed by a coat of light grey. I then painted the cobblestones a darker grey and applied a dark wash. Then using a rough sponge, I dabbed a very light grey paint across the curbstones for texture. I also picked out random cobblestones to be painted in various browns and greys to break up the pattern. I then applied a pigment wash, which was a mix of grey and brown pigment, to create the bedding mortar. Now that it was done, I glued the cobblestone yard section onto the baseboard, making sure that it sat evenly between the roads on either side. I then glued down the school building on the very edge of the board. For the raised garden beds and footpaths, I used a mix of AK Terrain's light earth and dark earth pastes. Here's where I stuffed up a little bit. I found that I actually applied the paste a little bit too thick, and when I checked in the morning, the paste had cracked. To fix this, I made a smaller batch of the same mix, added some leaf litter, which included dry herbs from the kitchen, and reapplied it over the surface. In front of the school entrance, I added a small card razor and topped it with AK's concrete paste to simulate the concrete footpath. Now finally, it was time to add the fence, trees and other details. Looking at the World War II aerial photos, I didn't see any stone walls or hedgerows enclosing the yard. With no solid wartime reference, I went with a timber fence, which seemed plausible for the period. For this, I used the Rubicon picket fence set, combining multiple sections to match the full length of the yard. This kit also included road signs, so I assembled one, and from the Rubicon utility and light pole set, I built a telegraph pole as well. I painted all of these details and used my earlier hairspray chipping technique on the fence to show wear and tear, revealing the timber underneath the paint. Next, I marked out all the positions for the fence posts, road signs and telegraph pole, Looking at the building today, you can see that it includes a large lean-to building butting up against it. I want to assume that this lean-to, or something similar, was here during World War II. For its walls, I used foam stone walls, the kind used in railway modelling, cutting them to shape, including the angled side walls to match the roof's pitch. To make the corrugated iron roof, I cut out a piece of Will's corrugated card to size. Then I took 2 balsa wood struts to act as roof supports and notched out each wall so they could slot in. I added a central support beam to the front support strut, then used 2 pieces of matchstick as joinery beams for extra realism. I painted the lean-to walls similarly to the main building, then added rust effects to the roof using a sponge and weathering pigments. And then I painted and highlighted the timber beams. Once all was dry, I glued the lean-to together. I applied PVA glue to areas where I wanted grass, then used my static grass applicator to lay down a layer of 2mm spring grass. With a light spray of PVA glue, I fixed down some 4mm dead grass in selected patches for variation. I glued the fence into place and added grass tufts for variety. And then glued down some scrim foliage into the garden island, and glued the telegraph pole into position. To make the street signs, I typed the road names into Word within arrow-shaped boxes, printed them out, cut them to size, and glued them onto the Rubicon signposts. I added a bit of rust pigment to age them before fixing them down. With the grass done, I glued the lean-to against the building. I also glued down a bit of leaf litter and dusted exposed soil with some European earth pigment. I purchased 4 trees to be placed within the yard. I glued needles into each of their trunks to act as pegs and then stuck them down securely. At the front and back of the building, I added a few knock flower pots, which, let's face it guys, are gorgeous.
Nearer the knee. John.
I took a hedge I'd previously built and sprayed it with quick grip, and sprinkled it with knock leaves. I then glued this down into a bare section of the fence line. Using the same leafing technique, I added some fine leaf foliage. One piece became ivy climbing up the building. And another was fixed into the garden island. And finally, I split some sticks of balsa wood down the middle to create firewood for the lean-to. I glued the pieces into a pile, painted them, and fixed them into place inside the structure. And with that, I called it done. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.